Welcome to the Wildlife for You podcast and the Old Man Johnson series. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Wildlife for You podcast and the Old Man Johnson series, where we try to debunk some of social media's most well-known wildlife myths. I am joined here by my silver-tongued and silver-haired co-host, Stephanie Payne. So thank you for joining us again, Steph.
Of course, Dee, where else would I rather be than riling up people and telling them that their long-held beliefs are a little more than fairy tales, completely false because they're based on false data or common misconceptions. I love this stuff.
I can sense the sarcasm just oozing from your veins. I like it. But all that aside, I have some great news for you, Steph. I know how much you hated me trying to impersonate the Old Man Johnson voice.
No, what are you talking about, Dee? I absolutely love watching you struggle with that voice. I mean, you nail it so well.
Well, don't you worry your pretty little head there about hearing Old Man Johnson on today's episode. You'll still be hearing him, but to save me a little face and quite possibly a hernia while trying to impersonate his voice, I did us both a favor. I brought a tape recorder with me when we went and had our little chat with him last week.
Oh my gosh, that was a lively little chat that we had with him the other day. Um, I'm still not sure it was a good thing though that we introduced him to hashtag Hazel, but it definitely made our time with him a bit more animated. That is for sure.
Yeah. Well, truthfully, Steph, I really don't think we have to worry none about them two getting along because I think Old Man Johnson appreciates having a young woman around to talk to. He still fancies those young women, you know. So while Hazel, on the other hand, Hazel thinks she's going to save the world, and it's likely going to have to start by saving Old Man Johnson.
So, Dee, two things. So, since you recorded a bit of their conversation, does this mean I don't have to do Hazel's voice this week either?
Lucky for you, no.
Woo-hoo! Okay, all right. So then please tell me that you recorded that tartlet part where they started going at each other about who pays for conservation.
Oh, would I ever let you down? Now, I thought that tartlet part was awesome, and that's exactly what I was hoping we would talk about on today's show. Because they got into that age old question of who pays for wildlife conservation. And as you can imagine, Old Man Johnson and hashtag Hazel, they were on completely opposite ends of the spectrum with this one. So here, let me see if I can cue up their argument from my recording. You ready? Let's see if I can find this.
Uh, Hold the pin and toss, my friend. I am very much ready for this.
All right, here we go. This is what we captured from their conversation.
Now listen here, you two little tartlets. I know for a fact that hunters and fishermen pay for wildlife conservation. Haven't you heard that saying? Hunting is conservation. If it weren't for me and my buddy Jeb here buying a hunting license every couple of years, you wouldn't have any of them pretty-looking Tweety birds you're always chasing with your binoculars.
Well, this little tartlet here loves those birds you mentioned, Mr. Johnson, and they are rightfully called Passerina cirrus, otherwise known as painted buntings. But you wouldn't know that because all you're interested in is shooting things. And don't get me started on paying for conservation. Hunters paying for conservation? Ha, what a joke. A study that came out a few years ago showed that wildlife lovers like me are the ones that actually pay for conservation. We pay for close to 94% of all wildlife conservation.
So, my little tartlet, did you notice that he said tartlets, like plural? And I'm too big to be a tartlet. I'm more like a puff muffin or something. But I just was wondering if you noticed that. But anyway, I thought that was funny. So what did you think of that debate between Old Man Johnson and hashtag Hazel there?
I think that he and I are gonna have words not fit for public ears about the tartlet thing, but yeah, oh boy, This is another one where I think we need to unpack this in sections. But first, let me summarize everything for our listeners based on what we heard there. So, what we're talking about here is the expense of wildlife conservation. We all know as Americans, we are truly blessed with having an abundance of wild places and more importantly for us, wild animals that we all know and love. But that actually comes at a cost. Having nice things is rarely free, and wildlife is no exception to that.
Well, let me jump in here real quick and ask a question some of our listeners may have.
Sure, go right ahead.
What in the HE double hockey sticks? What in the heck do you mean wildlife comes with a cost? They're free living wild animals. They don't cost anything. Like nobody paid for that deer or that Tweety bird to be here. Now, you know I'm smiling over here, Steph, but can you explain that part to our listeners?
Yeah, it's a good point because although it's obvious to you and I, it doesn't mean it's obvious to everyone else. So the fact that wildlife and wild animals live here in North America wild and free doesn't mean it's free to have them. So first off, wildlife have to have somewhere, to live. So the land that they live on, that costs money to maintain. Even on public land where there's an abundance, like out in the western states where you live, the land still has to be maintained. Then there's the programs that benefit certain species, like reintroduction programs. There's law enforcement programs, education programs, research programs, monitoring, you name it. The list literally goes on and on when it comes to things that are done in the name of wildlife conservation.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that for everyone. It truly does take lots and lots of money to help protect and preserve the wild animals we all love and enjoy. So let's dive into their argument that our two friends had. Now, Mr. Johnson said hunters and fishermen pay for wildlife conservation, while Miss Hazel laughed and said her nature-loving friends are the ones that truly pay for conservation. So can we begin to break down this argument here?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Dee. And since you spent the better part of your career working for a state wildlife agency, why don't you go ahead and talk about what Mr. Johnson is claiming, that the hunters and the fishermen pay for it all?
Okay, I'll gladly do that. But first, I'm going to have to give everyone a quick history lesson. So this idea that hunters pay for conservation, or sometimes you even hear it said that hunting is conservation, it's born out of some deep-rooted facts about where we, as North Americans, were as a society in the mid to late 19th century. And for those that aren't good at math, that's the late 1800s. So, Steph, can you describe the North American landscape during that time?
Well, I mean, while you would probably argue this, I actually wasn't around then. But I would imagine that it was a lot wilder and freer than what it is today. So folks probably thought there was an endless abundance of nature, especially if you were one of those early pioneers in those days, like seeing the areas that you live in and just everything. It was untamed. It was this infinite landscape. It was quite honestly stuff I dream about.
Exactly. And do you think at that time the idea of conserving anything was on anyone's mind?
Oh, no, I doubt it. It was probably more like, let's take what we can get while the getting's good, and let's get it all, because more is obviously better than less.
All right. Well, I'm going to tell you a little story about it. It just reminded me of thinking way back of when there's this infinite wild animals. I don't know if you recall, I used to do this student program for a number of years, like 7 years. I was doing this student program where we brought underprivileged youth or college students to different parts of the country. And back then, believe it or not, Steph, I used to post things on Facebook a whole lot more than I do now. I don't do nearly as much as I did back then, but back then, we had brought a number of students from Tennessee, and we were actually in New Mexico, and we were tromping around northern New Mexico where this guy by the name of Aldo Leopold used to live and work in northern New Mexico. And for those that don't know, Aldo Leopold is often considered the father of wildlife management. He's very well known in the biology realm. And we were actually visiting the house that he built for his wife in this beautiful, beautiful part of northern New Mexico. And back at that time, all the students were there. I was sitting on the porch, and I just couldn't believe it. I had goosebumps, like sitting where it all began. And I remember taking a picture out from his porch of this gorgeous landscape. And I posted it on the Facebook page because I was keep doing daily updates of what we were doing with the students. And I posted sitting on the porch of Aldo Leopold, where wildlife conservation all began back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is where we started this idea of wildlife are important and we need to conserve it. And I posted it, and I was just being reflective. And someone immediately responded, and they said, I can only dream how wonderful it must have been to have been Aldo Leopold sitting on that porch looking at herds upon herds of wild elk and mule deer and antelope grazing out in all those lands. And it dawned on me that people don't have any idea of what it was really like. Again, this is late 1800s, early 1900s. Can you guess what Aldo Leopold saw when he looked out there off his porch? Sheep.
What?
Tens of
Sheep.
thousands of sheep and livestock. There were no wild animals. The elk in New Mexico were extirpated. They were gone. And so he was sitting on that porch, literally moved to tears because of how that whole landscape looked. And that's kind of how this whole thing was born, this land ethic. So this world we're living in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was not idyllic, especially when it comes to North American wildlife. Now, most big game animals were extirpated. Like I said, they're completely wiped out from that area, and they're gone from a lot of their historic ranges. Same goes, it wasn't just the big animals. Same goes for a lot of the birds and the amphibians. The land at that time was drastically denuded, especially in the eastern half of the U.S. where you reside. And what seemed at that time like a land full of inexhaustible resources was pretty much at a precipice of being exhausted. And then all that changed because of some pretty bright minds.
Yeah, at the turn of the century, you had some great minds and some great people that were really beginning to step up for our natural resources. Besides Aldo Leopold, there was another guy that you may have heard of by the native name of Teddy Roosevelt, our first president who really championed the wildlife movement. But him and other folks like, Gifford Pinchot, John Muir, George Bird Grinnell, J. Ding Darling, William Hornaday, four folks that you likely probably heard of, but like me, we can't always remember exactly what they did. But regardless, they all started standing up and saying, hey, we got to do something here because we're about to lose the very thing that makes this country great. So really, that's when they started to create these working groups like the Boone and Crockett Club, the New York Zoological Society, the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club. They literally created a movement to protect our natural resources.
Yeah, absolutely. If it wasn't for them, we would be screwed. And the thing is, one of the greatest things to come out of that movement they created is likely the creation of government agencies, like whose sole mission for that agency is to protect wildlife and the natural resources in that area. Now, these agencies I'm speaking of are, of course, those individual state fish and wildlife agencies, or as many of them began, they were called state game commissions. Now, since at that time in the early to mid 1900s, lots of different animals were hunted, game commissions regulated what people could or couldn't kill. This was designed, of course, to prevent their overexploitation, which was rampant at the time.
Yeah, and I would like to point out when Daryl refers to game, He's often referring to the animals that are hunted for consumption, usually. So, but it's not always for consumption. But the vast majority of animal species that we're talking about here likely aren't hunted at all.
Yeah, but that's kind of the hidden beauty of it. The creation of these game agencies protected almost all the species because the way that they would regulate game animals or those hunted animals, you created a specially designed season, which was based on science. They had to study the animals quite a bit to learn as much as they could. But those seasons, they put a limit on the number of animals you could take, but they also put limits on the kind of animals you could take. Such an example is you could only shoot male deer. The reason they did this is this protected the bulk of the breeding population. And even though they were hunted animals, it still allowed their populations to thrive, even though they were hunted.
So, wait a minute, Dee. You likely lost a few folks there because you said that game agencies protected all animals, but you only mentioned the game animals that were hunted with specifically designed seasons.
Yes, and that's the key part. That is correct, because in most situations, the only animals you could hunt were the animals with seasons on them, hunting seasons on them, the game animals. All those other non-game animals like frogs, lizards, songbirds, etc., they were pretty much protected by default because there was no seasons. There was no legal season for you to hunt those animals. So the state game or wildlife agencies, they truly became the champions for wildlife conservation. They more or less protected close to all the species of wildlife with their creation.
Okay. So I think that cleared it up that and that probably actually leads us into Old Man Johnson's claim that the hunters and fishermen fund conservation.
Exactly. And so, Steph, do you want to explain to the audience now? Explain to them where state wildlife agencies receive the majority of their funding?
Sure thing. So now the one thing that I'd like to point out is that funding mechanisms state by state are very nuanced. No two states are exactly alike with how they're governed or how they're funded. But that's the beauty and kind of somewhat of the curse of having 50 different wildlife agencies. But in general, things are somewhat similar with only minor differences. But contrary to what many people believe, state wildlife agencies are typically not funded by state taxes for states that do have taxes. But, um, regardless, most wildlife agencies generate their own funding, so they're self supported.
And where does that money come from to support those agencies?
There are always lots of ways that state wildlife agencies generate money, but the two primary methods are from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses, like the one that Old Man Johnson and his buddy Jeb buy on occasion. So yes, hunters and fishermen do contribute the lion's share to that pot of money. The other big source of funding is federal aid money in the form of Pittman-Robertson funds. Daryl, this one is definitely more in your domain, and you know more about this program than I likely ever will. So I will let you explain that program.
Sure thing. Now, again, back in those bleak, sullen days of wildlife in the early 1900s, a group of people, again, mostly hunters, they petitioned Congress to do something about it. And the sad state of affairs of our natural world, it was, we needed action done. So in 1937, there was this thing called the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act that was passed by Congress. And what this did is it placed an excise tax, an extra tax on firearms or guns. It also placed a tax on the ammunition. It also taxed archery equipment, so the typical tools you would use to hunt. All that money that was collected from this tax by the federal government would then be used for wildlife, for habitat restoration, for specific wildlife programs, for hunter education, etc. Now, I should add that that was a great step because it was tapping into the hunters. And not long after that Pittman-Robertson Act came about, I think like 13 years later, the Dingell-Johnson Act was passed, I believe 1950, which pretty much did the same thing, but is on the fish or the aquatic side of the equation. So they taxed things like fishing equipment and boat fuel. Now, keep in mind, over the years, those two acts, Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson, they've generated almost $40 billion for fish and wildlife programs.
So, Daryl, real quick, how do states, because you said that's federal, so how do states get their hands on that money?
Well, it's laid out in the act, but it's kind of simple. It's based on the land area of the state. So obviously a bigger state with a lot more wildlife is going to have a lot more need. So it's based on the land area of that state and actually the number of paid hunting license holders within that state. So the more hunters, the bigger pot of the bigger piece. I was gonna say the bigger pot of pie, but it's piece of pie that we get. Sorry, I got a little tongue tied there.
Mixing metaphors.
But here's the thing, Steph. Each year, depending on the state, especially right now, I'm sure it was less back then, but right now, you're looking at millions to tens of millions of dollars per state. Now, in order to get those funds, in order for the state wildlife agency to get the funds, that agency needs to have a plan in place demonstrating that the money's actually going strictly to wildlife programs. Like they can't use it, for example, they can't use it for law enforcement. They got to use it for funding habitat restoration, wildlife restoration. So you have to have a plan in place. You got to show the feds where that money's going to. So it's tightly regulated.
Okay. So since that money, the wildlife money, is generated by a tax on guns and ammunition, and then the other one on the aquatic equivalents, but I can see why Old Man Johnson is adamant about hunters being the primary source of funding wildlife conservation.
Can I put a little asterisk on a couple of his statements, though?
You definitely can. I think that's cool.
And it's not like I was waiting for your permission. I was just waiting for you to respond. I was going whether or not you granted me that permission.
Yeah.
So now I don't disagree with Old Man Johnson about hunters paying for conservation, but understand it's not like the hunting community is coming out and freely donating all this money. It's not like we're doing it out of charity to say, oh, here's all the money. We're literally taxing the hunters and fishermen. And so it's kind of like we're forcing those folks to pay. Now, I'm sure if you ask someone, would you rather have like a free hunting license or one that you have to pay for it? Most would rather not pay for it. But we do have to credit our forefathers for having the insight to set up this self-imposed tax to begin with. Now, also the other thing, that excise tax is the gun tax. Do you think hunting rifles, well, let's talk about like currently right now today. Do you think hunting rifles make up the majority of gun sales today?
In today's world, I'm leaning no. I bet that's actually only a small portion of the guns and ammunition that are in current era, current day, bought and sold. I imagine it's mostly pistols and handguns and other non-hunting types of munitions. But well, I mean, at least it's all going to wildlife, so that's good.
Yeah. So do you think that's where hashtag Hazel was coming from when she said the vast majority of wildlife funding comes from non-hunting public?
I'm not sure I'm gonna buy what you're selling there, but now that you mentioned it, it did intrigue me when she was kind of spouting her information. So I tracked down the source of her claims. She said something like 94% of wildlife funding comes from people like her. Now, apparently, this comes from a report that she read that was put together by two guys, Mark Smith and I think it was Mark E. Smith and Donald A. Mold, back in like 2015. But these two gentlemen, they tried taking a deeper dive into the who actually pays for wildlife conservation talk, and they wanted to know if sportsmen, i.e., hunters and fishermen, are truly the ones who pay for conservation.
So what you find out?
Well, the first thing that jumped out at me big time was that what they said about, or maybe it didn't say about state funding. So there's tell you what, here's a line. Let me pull it up here. Here's a line directly taken from the report that I highlighted. State funding was not considered in this study, in part because most state wildlife agency funding flows from the federal government, and in part because it would be a task larger than our resources allowed. So, first off, most state funding does not flow from the federal government. Most of it, again, comes from those license dollars. We already kind of mentioned that. But even more frustrating to me anyway was the part where they said we're not going to analyze this because we don't have the resources to look at what's really funding wildlife. So for me, reading that right there, that was a big red flag.
So they didn't look at state wildlife agency funding. So what did they analyze?
They looked at federal land management agencies and conservation organizations. So they looked at the overall budgets of the federal agencies like the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, USDA Wildlife Service.
Wait a minute, wait a minute. Most of those agencies, well, I shouldn't say most, but some of those agencies, the bigger ones, they're not wildlife agencies. The best way to say it is they're multi-use agencies managing a ton of land for multiple purposes. The two biggies that you mentioned, the Forest Service and the BLM, they manage something like 400 million acres of land, but it's not for wildlife. Well, it is, but it's for timber production. It's for the American people, and we need resources for the American people. So they manage a lot of that land for things like timber production, grazing, mining, gas and oil, energy development, recreation, cultural resources. So wildlife, it's only a small fraction of what those agencies oversee.
Well, don't tell them that because they factored in their budgets as if they were managing for the wildland and the wildlife. So don't forget, they also looked at a slew of conservation and philanthropic organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, National Audubon Society, Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
Wait a minute, wait a minute. Before you go too much further, I'm a little confused because first off, when it comes to wildlife, the federal agencies and the conservation organizations, I hate to say this, but there's very little wildlife conservation that they're doing without the state wildlife agencies being involved. So, like federal land management agencies, they typically defer to the states and private wildlife groups. They simply don't have jurisdiction to do any sort of wildlife management. Now, I think the main thing I have a hard time understanding is what are they actually calling wildlife conservation work?
And that's a really good question, Dee, because in their report, they say state level funding can reasonably be classified as hunting or sportsman services rather than wildlife management.
So they're saying having laws to protect wildlife is providing a service to the hunters and not the wildlife. That's that's totally absurd.
I kind of had that same absurd feeling reading that report. And I realize we are probably not making friends right now, but it goes to that old adage that you and I have expressed time and time again. Wildlife management is not managing wildlife, it's managing people. So the bottom line is the report that hashtag Hazel refers to that suggests that non-hunters pay for like 94% of conservation. I mean, I think we and most agree that that's poorly written and based on incomplete data, and it really contains some major overassumptions.
Well, I will tell you, Steph, I took a little peek at that report before we got on air tonight. Did you happen to see who funded it?
No.
It was, I think it was primarily funded by the Humane Society. So you have to, and I'm not saying anything too negative about them, but whenever you look at an argument rationally, you got to do investigative work. Like, what's the motives behind the two different sides of the argument? And you got to weigh all of that in. And so the fact that they really downplayed one section and hyped up another section, we do the same thing. Whatever side we're on, we tend to fight for our side. But it just, you mentioned a red flag popping up, and after I looked at it, I had a number of red flags pop up on my end as well. So I guess what you're telling me right now, Steph, is that Old Man Johnson appeared to be more in the right.
Yeah, I'm not saying he's completely right, but I think based on everything that we know about the history of wildlife conservation and the way that the state and federal agencies operate, Old Man Johnson is more accurate than hashtag Hazel in this case. So wildlife conservation, it is actually still primarily funded by hunters and fishermen.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with you there, Steph. Now, I'm not saying it should stay that way, because as it currently is set up, we really, really, really do need to get more non-hunters involved in funding this wildlife conservation apparatus.
I completely agree. And to just kind of brainstorm for a second, we've looked at ways to make that work, and it's been a difficult. Well, I
Mm-hmm.
know you and I, God, a decade ago, I remember us sitting at a table and having a discussion about how we could engage more of the non-consumption wildlife peoples to help support and fund wildlife. And you kind of have that same thing that you brought up a minute ago, where you're talking about if you asked a hunter if they wanted to pay for a license or get one for free, it's the same thing, right? Like if you want to ask a birder if they want to pay a fee to go birding on a piece of land or do it for free, they're going to always want to do it for free, and they will complain vehemently if you decide that you're going to start charging that because of the perception of how the funding mechanisms go for wildlife. So,
Yeah, no, I'm going to throw something in on there. That's why I said before, we have to give credit where credit's due. And the foresight almost 100 years ago to say, let's institute this tax on ourselves because we care about wildlife. It would be so difficult to get Congress. Can you imagine getting Congress to impose a tax on birdseed or binoculars? Or it's likely never going to happen. And so, truly big shout out needs to go to those forefathers of wildlife conservation for instilling that and having the will to get that passed. And I don't mind saying they were mostly hunters. They cared about their resource. And so it's a hard pill for some people to swallow. How could you be a hunter and care for wildlife? But as a hunter, you want as much wildlife around as you can possibly get.
and that leads me to one question that I want to ask you. Is the true debate about who funds wildlife conservation, or is it really more of a deep-seated dispute between people who are pro hunting and or pro wildlife consumption as opposed to preservationist mentality?
Super good question. And I think our approach by looking actually at the history of our model of wildlife conservation today and knowing that the history shows it was set up by hunters and fishermen and it's currently funded mostly through state wildlife agencies are the arm for wildlife conservation. Federal agencies, yeah, they own a lot of land, but it's truly the state wildlife agencies that are the ones that are protecting the animals. And so I think we analyzed it properly, but that's what I love about these debates between Old Man Johnson and hashtag Hazel is we'll have two sides of the coin. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Stephanie. I think a lot of our discussions moving forward will be from that I'm going to use words that I actually hate, but the consumptive and non-consumptive, like people use wildlife for a number of reasons. whether or not it's food or recreation or anything like that. But it often boils down to whether or not the killing of animals is acceptable or not. And that's going to play a big part into our discussions moving forward.
Agreed. So, one last question for you there, bud. Do you think we've covered this topic thoroughly?
I don't know. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Oh, wait a second. I actually have one. I heard we actually had another listener. So, Rob, if you're listening, thank you for being our fourth listener. Now, I'm sure you joined in to hear Stephanie talk, but hey, we'll take whatever we can get. So, appreciate you joining in, Rob, and glad to have you. So, that's it.
He is a Daryl fan. Yeah, no, he's a Daryl fan. Just accept it, buddy. Live it. Own it.
Whatever.
Okay, so once again, folks, we love talking to you about wildlife. We love just period talking about wildlife, but if you're willing to listen to us, that just makes us even happier. And we do enjoy trying to clear up some of the misinformation that you hear out there. But we also do love listening to you. So if you have any topics that you'd like for us to explore, maybe something you heard Old Man Johnson or hashtag Hazel talk about, please reach out to us. You can either reach us through the Wildlife for You Facebook Messenger, or you can email us at wfyquestions@gmail.com.
Yes, we would absolutely love to hear from you with whatever topic ideas you may have, any compliments, so on and so forth. Criticism, yes, we'll take those too. But we do thank you for listening. And remember, folks, when it comes to wildlife, your knowledge often means their existence. So thank you and be well. Peace.